Okay, shall we start? So welcome everybody, regulars and newcomers. I'm Jerry Singerman, one of the three coordinators of this workshop, along with John Pollock, who's running around over there, curator of research services at the Kislak Center, and Zach Lesser, professor of English here at Penn. And of course, all of this is made to run smoothly by our Bristol Schoenberg fellow, Eileen Malcolm, from whom you get regular emails and so much more. There is a sign-up sheet going around, so please be sure to sign it and put in your email address. And this is important if you want to be added to our listserv and you're not on it already, but it's also important for COVID tracking. So please be sure to fill that out. I'm pleased to remind everybody that next week we're going to have a triple header when Michael Suarez will be here to give his Rosenbach lectures on the topic of printing abolition, how the fight to ban the British slave trade was won 1783 to 1807. The talks will take place in person here in the Kislak Center in this space, but also through Zoom, and they will be at 5:30, so almost at our regular time on Monday, with following lectures on Tuesday and Thursday, also at 5:30 in this place and on Zoom. The library requests that anybody planning to attend, whether in person or online, register in advance. And you can find the necessary and relevant information by Googling Rosenbach lectures and bibliography or going to the library site.
And Jerry, you could mention there'll be a Wednesday seminar too.
Okay, there's going to be a Wednesday seminar too. Is that going to be at 10 o'clock or?
At around 10 o'clock in the Lee Library with Michael Forrest.
Okay, and so I guess all are welcome to. People need to sign up for that in advance.
Nope.
Okay, so walk-ins are welcome. And I just want to say, for anybody who's not had the previous pleasure of hearing Michael Suarez, those of us who have can attest that he's really one of the most engaging and charismatic speakers on matters of the history of the book imaginable. And I really enthusiastically recommend the lectures. So on to tonight's speaker. Brenton Sullivan is Associate Professor of Religion at Colgate, and almost as importantly, at least to some of us, he's our first live and in-person out-of-town speaker since March of 2020. So this feels, if not the dawn of the new age, at least the dawnlet, I don't know. We're beginning to see the rosy fingers over the horizon. So Brenton was educated at the University of Notre Dame, at the University of Kansas, and at the University of Virginia, where he took his PhD in the history of religion. In addition to Colgate, he's taught at the University of British Columbia and has been a visiting scholar at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. I'm going to mispronounce this, the Qinghai Academy of Social Sciences. Qinghai Academy of Social Sciences. I told you I'd mispronounce it. Peking University, which is still Peking rather than Beijing University.
I think the English is still Peking.
Okay. And he's held Fulbright and other grants from the US Department of Education. His writing has appeared in the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, the Revue d'études tibétaines, and the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. And he's author of Building a Religious Empire, Tibetan Buddhism, Bureaucracy, and the Rise of the Gelukpa, yes, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in Victor Mayer's series, Encounters with Asia. The book was published earlier this year. When I was at the press, I worked on Brenton's book only in its very late stages. I was the in-house caretaker for the Encounters with Asia series after the departure of a colleague who had ushered through the project initially. But though the book is on a topic far from any one with which I have any real familiarity, it's also one that seemed immediately and fruitfully resonant with many of the things about which I and other of my Penn authors, and certainly not least the participants in this workshop have been thinking about from time to time, and especially this year when we have a kind of special subtopic on foundational documents. Now, for my frame of reference, it was that historians of medieval Western monasticism, for example, have long studied, and I dare say puzzled over, the extraordinary rise and spread of the Cistercian order in the 12th century, and the role that its supposed founding document, the Carta Caritatis, had played in making that possible. So the questions are, did the document set the course for Cistercian practice and expansion, or was it, as some have claimed, a back formation, a document written after the fact to explain what had already happened? Was it a founding document, in other words, or a pseudo-founding document? Even some would claim a forgery, although that category in some ways seems anachronistic. And what were the stakes in deciding what it was? And the stakes for scholars of Cistercianism and Cistercians are very high indeed. One review of a book that was arguing about the back formation that appeared in Cistercian Studies, the review was a rebuttal of the book, and it ran to close to 100 printed pages. And then there was a rebuttal of the rebuttal. So I actually don't know whether Brenton's argument is similarly controversial or not. In his study, he shows us that for the particular school of Tibetan Buddhism that he's looking at, which is, I guess, the largest branch and is the branch to which the Dalai Lama belongs, the case for treating extant charters as true founding documents seems to be more straightforward. Their reach was and remains tremendous, not only because we're talking about the uniform governance of, I guess, thousands of monasteries that were established from the mid-17th century on and over an immense swath of territories, but also because the bureaucracy they set in place shaped both spiritual practice and the implementation of those tools for standardization, record keeping, the deployment of manpower that we more readily associate with secular state making. Or so I understood or understand from the book. But as I said, these are matters about which I know very little indeed. And it's my great pleasure to get out of the way and hand the floor over to Brenton for elucidation. Before we do, I just want to add, for the sake of those of you who are Zooming, that to participate in the Q&A after the talk, you can raise your hand and we will recognize you and zoom you onto the screen. Or if you're feeling a bit reticent, you can pose your questions in the chat function, and we will do the best to call on you. So welcome everybody here and in the computer, and welcome Brenton. So.
Well, thank you all for being here. And I'm very happy that I can be here for this first in-person encounter. It's also my first in-person talk in over a year. And I have to say, it's very exciting to be able to be in a room with other people and do this. Research isn't the same alone or on Zoom, although it does add something. And so to those of you coming in via Zoom, thanks for being here too. Jerry didn't introduce himself to me with his last name, and so I didn't realize when you introduced yourself that you are the Jerry who worked with me for over a year on the book. But very nice to meet you, and thank you for the introduction. Yes. And thank you also to Zach Lesser and John Polak and to Eileen Malcolm for inviting me and organizing my trip here today. I understand that the general workshop theme for the history of material text this year is foundational documents, material texts that are imagined to create or help shape institutions and practices. And I do think that the topic of my book, Building a Religious Empire, and the topic of my talk today speaks very much to this theme. I'll be talking about what I call monastic constitutions, Buddhist monastic constitutions. And I just want to start by showing you a few slides of images. I know you guys typically you like to see the images. This is a textual workshop. I don't actually have a lot of images of my own. And part of that, I think, has to do with the fact that these documents are still used and they're also considered quite valuable. So this is one example at a monastery in Inner Mongolia, Alasha. It's a recent reproduction of the original. They do have the original. This is but a recent reproduction of it. And even so, it's still quite valuable. It's a scroll that's kept by the monastery's highest officials. Here's another such example. This one likewise rolled up, and it was only taken out because of my request and the generosity of the monks there. So these are, of course, texts that I can't very easily in today's century anyway, in good conscience take from them, even if I were able. Occasionally, very rarely, but occasionally you'll find these documents up on walls, these Buddhist monastic constitutions. In this case, it's actually both on the back left wall and the back right wall. It's bilingual. On the left is the Chinese. Sorry, on the left is the Tibetan and on the right is the Chinese. More often than not, though, these texts today come to the scholar researching them, come to me, in this form, block texts, block prints, xylographs. And I did have a couple examples I was going to bring with me, and I left them in my rental car. Apologies. Your library did actually, on request, bring out a couple of items from the stacks. This is a reproduction of just such a block print. It's actually one that I've not laid eyes on before. It was, yeah, I had not seen it until this year. And so when I saw it in the stacks, I asked it to be called up. The other is a modern, it's a 17th century text, but it's a modern book print reproduction of it for a monastery in Nepal. So most of the time, these texts, these Buddhist monastic constitutions come to us in this form. They come to us in block prints, and they are also coming to us in the collected works of their authors, most often. So where are we in space? We are on the Tibetan plateau, particularly down in starting out in South Central Tibet here in Lhasa, but then ultimately spreading eastward, northeastward up into this area of Amdo, northeastern Tibet, and from there into Inner Mongolia and beyond into Mongolia more generally. This is the space that we're talking about in Asia. When are we talking about? We're talking about especially the 17th century and 18th century, when the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism, as Jerry mentioned, the most influential, the most widespread, the most powerful school in the past 400 years of Tibet and Mongolian history, when they really came into their own. The school dates back farther to its founder in the 14th century, known as Tsongkhapa, but it was under the auspices of the 5th Dalai Lama, this figure here, when the Geluk school came into its own and exercised a hegemony, religious and political, over Tibet, and ultimately over religiously much of Mongolia too. So the point of my talk today is that these constitutions, they were foundational for the rise and success of this school of Tibetan Buddhism, the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. Its most iconic figure today is the Dalai Lama. They are known for their philosophical acumen. Their form of scholasticism takes the form of very vocal and histrionic debate. And if you think of Buddhism, you likely also think of meditation. My point in both my book and in my talk today is that they also came into power through their use of these texts, these bureaucratic texts that lay the foundation for how a monastery is to operate and what life within a monastery is to look like. So what are in these texts? This is this is actually the very first constitution I ever looked at for a very small hermitage, but very old hermitage in northeastern Tibet known as Dentik. And I've actually passed around a very short translation of that text. I don't know that I need to read through all of it, and I didn't even bring myself a copy. Is there an extra copy? Excellent. This is a very short one, and there are a few things we can say about it, but I've broken it into parts here. And one of the things that this short constitution exemplifies is an emphasis on conduct, just disciplinary conduct, how a monk is supposed to comport themselves. And the language that's used in this constitution is quite formulaic, and you find it in the dozens and, well, almost 200 constitutions that are currently extant and available to us. So in the first page, halfway down, part 1, it talks about the procedures for going to assembly. And the first thing it says is you got to be on time. No matter when prayer festivals or Dharma sessions occur, the conch shell is played once and then twice, at which point young and old are to dress appropriately, avoiding the two extremes. Those over 50 wear their ceremonial hats. Those under 50 carry them on their shoulders and are to conduct themselves virtuously. So references here to age. Apart from that, there's to be no chatter, no yelling, screaming, arguing, or any other behavior that would appear unseemly in the eyes of an outsider. And this is one of the things you see in a lot of these constitutions is there's a concern about how you appear to outsiders. And so conduct comes up in every constitution you'll read. And this is, in many ways, this is typical. The other thing that really stands out in this constitution is continuing with that sentence where I left off. The next sentence begins, when the conch shell is played for the third time, young and old together sing in a ponderous voice, the Miksema. This is a prayer to the founder of the Geluk school, Tsongkhapa. So there's a sectarian angle to this constitution, as there are in most other constitutions too. But otherwise, this constitution, it's pretty brief. There's not a whole lot else I want to say about this example, but I give you this very short translation that I made for today's talk to hold on to. It's unauthored. I don't know when or where it was composed, but it does exemplify for us one of the aspects of all these constitutions, which is the emphasis on conduct. Here is that hermitage in a very secluded valley in northeastern Tibet. On a map, it's roughly located there, southeast of the city of Xining.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a line at the top of the second page that I just think you have to read the second or third sentence there.
The third sentence? Okay. As for one's own behavior, no matter what arises, he should sit there. There is to be absolutely no chatter, babble, and so forth. If unwittingly there's coughing, sneezing, or flatulence, one should conceal it inside one's robes. And I would say the same applies here for today's talk too. Yeah, they don't shy away from, I mean, the next paragraph down, you'll see moving one's jowls back and forth like a windstorm, sticking one's tongue out of their mouth, licking their food. Yeah, there is a real concern here with propriety and looking good. But this is not the only thing these constitutions are concerned with. If they were, I don't think they would be as interesting to me as they were. Before I talk a little bit more about the content of some of the other things you'll find in these constitutions, and by the way, please, I don't know what the typical format is for this, but if you have comments or questions, please chime in at any point. Yeah. I wanted to say a word about their application, how they're deployed. And there are various references both in the historical literature, but also from 19th and 20th century observations about how these are used, plus actually talking with monastic officials today. they are brought out several times a year and either recited or they're lectured on to the congregation of monks. So there is a reality. I would say these are very clearly normative documents about how the ideal monastery should look like and operate, but there is a reality to them as well. They are known. And this quote, for instance, talks about, this is from a monastic constitution from the 18th century, from 1737. And we read, the abbot and disciplinarian are to give 3 disciplinary sermons at each of the month-long Dharma sessions, which there are 4 in a year at a big monastery, or otherwise at shorter sessions, they are to give 2 disciplinary sermons. They are to be both broad and detailed. That is, the sermons are to be broad and detailed like the constitutions. And in particular, they are to be disciplinary sermons that look closely at the large and small transgressions of what is right. There is an anthropologist, Michael Limpert, who has written about these disciplinary sermons in contemporary monasteries in the exile, Tibetan exile communities of India. And he talks about the role these disciplinary sermons have in encouraging discipline at the monasteries. And he talks in particular about the kind of anonymous nature in which these are given and the anonymous nature in which people are called out. He writes, in reprimand, disciplinary sermons, the disciplinarian seeks to reform the moral dispositions of monks through projecting, juxtaposing, and evaluating morally weighted social voices, like the voice of the derelict monk, whose failings are spelled out, sometimes in graphic detail, enough to make the guilty party squirm, whose subjectivity is exposed to the glare of public scrutiny, but whose voice remains anonymous. No finger pointing, no proper names. The disciplinarian praised this brand of indirection. The objective is to induce in the wrongdoer's mind the thought, I am the one about whom the disciplinarian speaks. Right, so there is this aspect again of these constitutions, which speaks to conduct, but I just wanted to make a note about how they are actually living documents that come out and are deployed by the current disciplinarian or by the current abbot. So I mentioned just a moment ago in passing this monastery this constitution from 1737 for a monastery. That monastery is known as Gunlung Monastery. It's the red dot here, just north and east of Xining. Today you can do it by highway in about 15 minutes. Here is a photograph of part of that monastery and the neighboring village that's actually encroaching upon monastic lands. We actually know it's encroaching upon monastic lands, not just because the monks today say so, but you can go back to the Constitution from 1737, where they specify the boundaries of the monastery. So there was an attempt to codify boundaries by the monastery at that time. So from this monastery, we can look at its 1737 Constitution and start to get an idea of some of the other things we'll find in these monastic constitutions. And here, this very long quote, what it really helps to exemplify is the specified hierarchy within the monastery and the different levels of pay that each individual receives based on their status, as well as actually an emphasis on the equitable distribution, right? So it's specified so that people get what they deserve. And I won't read the entirety of this, but I want you to give a sense of the range here. At the very top, we read, as for shares of alms that come into the monastery, from whatever cash and bread appears as donations from laity, the master throne holder, the abbot, receives 10. Retired abbots and the Tantric College Lama receive 5. The sacrificial cake offering Lama, the Lama Cantor of the Tantric College, the disciplinarian officers, and the great cantor receive 3 shares and a great namshak. And you go down to the bottom of the second paragraph and you see this very long list of different functionaries within the monastery, including water carriers and tea servers. They get 2. And in the very last paragraph are those who get just 1 share. The leg bone trumpet blowers, other musicians, incense bearers, the cushion carriers, and so forth. They each get 1 share of cash, tips, and bread. And so this wasn't left up to chance, and it wasn't left up to the whim of whoever was in charge. It was being specified and codified by the author. Now, this monastery I mentioned is this red dot here. It's way up in northeastern Tibet in Amdo. It was actually written by a Lama way down here, whose own monastery is way down here in Lhasa, right? Several hundred miles away. And this is one of the main things I want to call attention to today, is the way in which these constitutions were being broadcast and disseminated by more centrally located monasteries to ones further away. Now, another thing we get in these constitutions is, okay, we have money coming in and we want to make sure it's properly, equitably distributed, but you also have to know who's responsible for paying those. Of course, the laity are mentioned in some of these constitutions, and they have obligations, particularly the feuds, if you will, of the monastery. People who are subjects of the monastery living on monastery land, they will be called out and have certain financial obligations to the monastery. But beyond that, there's the abbot has specified financial obligations, but also a newly created office, which I translate as the General Management Office, the JISO or JISA. This office also has specified financial obligations. This office is unique to the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism, or I would say it was first popularized by the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. Here is a historical text from the 18th century, talking about the creation of this General Management Office. Just what is it? We read, formerly the Lama, the abbot, and the General Management Office did not exist separately, and thus there were no tea meals apart from those of the 4 major Dharma sessions. In other words, if you're a monk going to assembly, there aren't meals regularly day to day. For many monks who had come from far away to study and so forth, this was very grueling. So this figure, Gandenserti, found this unbearable and so consulted with the officers, teachers, and other decision makers of Gomang College at this monastery, whereupon they established additional public goods and established a custom of continuously providing 2 monks' teas in the mid-morning. Tea is like English tea. It's more than just the drink. It's the food too. Therefore, he is known as a most compassionate contributor to this college in terms of the 2 systems, spiritual and worldly. So this system of a general management office that oversees funds specified for the monks and for regularly helping to feed those monks is something that spread then from central Tibet outward into the rest of Tibet and Mongolia. And that office had financial obligations. For instance, at that monastery of Gunlung I was mentioning a moment ago in far northeastern Tibet, the General Management Office was responsible for expenses at all of the Dharma sessions throughout the year. So these are like semesters for the students who are enrolled in philosophy and debate classes. They were responsible for the big New Year Great Prayer Festival, a 2-3 week long ritual assembly. And there are 2 other major events at the end of the year, ritual occasions, which again, they're responsible for feeding these monks. How many monks? Well, at its height, this particular monastery had about 2,400 monks, it seems, somewhere in that range. And some of the biggest monasteries in central Tibet had 2 or 3 times or 4 times that number. Now, not all monasteries were that size, but some of the largest were. And so it was a big financial obligation, hence the need to specify who was responsible for providing for all of those mouths. Another thing these constitutions did and do is they specify the curriculum for studies for those who are engaged in philosophical study. This is a 19th century historical text, but referring to an earlier stage in the development of this one monastery in northeastern Tibet. And it tells us that there was a constitution written for it by none other than that great 5th Dalai Lama, that figure from the 17th century, who really is responsible for helping the Geluk school come into its own. And there in 13 parts are the different aspects of the curriculum to be studied at this monastery. What I want to draw attention to is just a couple of things. One is under point number 13 sorry, right after that. Their studies of the 5 scriptures are unmatched as they follow the old textbook of Gomong. Gomong is a centrally located monastery in Lhasa. So what we're being told here is that the constitution or the curriculum being specified for this monastery way out in northeastern Tibet is to follow the same, that it uses the textbooks and follows in part the curriculum for a monastery way back in Lhasa, Gomang. Similarly, in the very next phrase, Kilkongba's textbook for Vinaya, this is a reference to an abbot of another centrally located monastery, the monastery of the Panchen Lama in central Tibet, right? So explicit links are being drawn between these places farther afield and the more centrally located ones. Now, at first, this process, particularly in the 17th and early 18th century, was one whereby monks and abbots in central Tibet were disseminating these constitutions for monasteries in, say, on the periphery of the Tibetan plateau. But eventually, those places became centers in their own right, and they began specifying the proper practices of a monastery for places farther afield in Inner Mongolia. So, for instance, we have this red dot here is roughly where a monastery in Ushin Banner in Inner Mongolia is located, and for which we have a constitution. So actually, let me go back here, 2 dots. So one is for Ushin Banner and the other is for Sunit Banner in the far upper right-hand corner. Two princedoms in Inner Mongolia where monasteries were located. The constitutions for these in the late 18th century were being written by a monk, by a lama at Gunlung Monastery in northeastern Tibet, right? So now the broadcast is going farther. This is not one of those Inner Mongol monasteries. However, it is another monastery for which that same lama penned a constitution. I'm trying to be conscious of time here. And
You're doing fine.
I'm doing okay.
Yeah.
So what's interesting about these constitutions and what we haven't yet discussed is that they're also specifying here the liturgy, the ritual. Now that might seem, of course, foreign to us today, but it's actually what monks are doing most of the time. And so the fact that these constitutions are also telling monasteries farther afield what they're supposed to be reciting and on what day is actually really important for understanding how these monasteries that are far, far apart in space in pre-modern times ended up looking very similar to one another. So in this case, this constitution, this page from this constitution here, it tells the reader that the essential must be firmly established. What is the essential? Reading and writing, rituals, and the liturgy, as well as the order of recitations at assembly. One must be a great absorber of the exoteric and esoteric scriptures that accord with his intellectual capacities, and he must exert himself in practices that load his mind stream with the meaning of these scriptures. In particular, the manner of sitting during assembly, the manner of taking mass tea, the manner of reciting, chanting, all of this must accord with the conduct found in a large monastery. And I emphasize here, again, the explicit link to larger monasteries located back closer to central Tibet. So this is taken from a constitution written for a monastery in Inner Mongolia in the Ushin Banner. In another constitution written by the same author for a different Inner Mongolian banner, he has 6 sections. In the next page here, I'm just going to show you one relating to the first section. That is, what do you do every day when you go to assembly? Typically, you're going to assembly 3 times a day. And so it tells us, as for the assemblies to be carried out each year, their liturgy and the order of the liturgy, first, the continuous recitations are every day. At the morning tea, there are offerings to the lineage masters, the 100 ritual cake offerings, the ritual cake offerings to the serpent deities, smoke offerings, and so forth. At midday, there are petitions and offerings to the soul hero Vajrabhairava. This is a tantric deity, and the 12 steadfast protector goddesses, and whatever restoration ritual that is appropriate. At evening tea, one recites the white umbrella, Tara, the Heart Sutra, the lion-faced one, and the torch of the teachings. Now, in addition to just specifying what the liturgy is, if we start to look at what these texts are, we start to see there's a sectarian nature to them, which is not surprising. So the reference to the Vajrabhairava, this tantric deity, this is an important tantric deity specifically for the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. The sequence of rituals that are conducted at the evening assembly, you find these at Geluk monasteries across Tibet, where the evening assembly is set aside as for protective rituals, rituals that ward off evil and protect the monastery. And you find the same sequence of prayers at at Geluk monasteries across Tibet. The lion face, this reference to the lion-faced one, this is a prayer written by the Panchen Lama. Maybe not heard of the Panchen Lama, but maybe you have. And if you have, it's because he's probably the second most well-known Lama after the Dalai Lama. And so again, there's a sectarian nature here, but there's also these links back to central Tibet because the Panchen Lama, his monastery is in central Tibet. This is that very first image I showed you of a big, long constitution from a monastery in Alasha in Inner Mongolia. This is the reproduction of it. And here is an image of that monastery. It is the red dot, the last one added here, right about here, its location. It too, the constitution for it is probably in the latter half of the 18th century. We know this from the author. The author is also from the Tibetan Plateau, but from the northeastern corner, from that same monastery, actually, of Gunlung Monastery, although he spent much of his life at the imperial court in Beijing. He penned this. We know he penned this because the seal, both on the original and this reproduction, is his seal. It is the Guanding Pushan Wang Ci Daguo Shi, the great state tantric preceptor who extends goodness and spreads compassion. This is his title given to him by the Kangxi, the Manchu Kangxi emperor. And then the image below that is of the tantric deity Shinje Chujel, the Yama Dhamaraja, who's the protector of those engaged in tantric visualization practices associated with the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism. So this constitution does something that that I haven't talked about yet. This will be the last kind of theme of different topics addressed in constitutions that I'll speak to today. And that is, this constitution is thoroughly tantric in nature. So I've already mentioned that constitutions will speak about discipline and conduct within the monastery. They give us a clear hierarchy, positions within the monastery. They specify rank. They emphasize the equitable and proper distribution of alms. They specify a liturgy, a calendar throughout the year, how one is supposed to perform their rituals. But they also can be very tantric in nature. And this one is thoroughly tantric, specifying the unique deities, the tantric Buddhas and Bodhisattvas that are and protector deities that are to be worshipped at this monastery. And I'm really probably just going to summarize what we find here instead of reading to you. This is a reference to some of the tantric rituals to be performed at this monastery, written by this Lama from the Tibetan Plateau. And again, it's making a specific reference here to a figure from central Tibet, Buddha Rinchen Dup. This figure here, you're supposed to follow his ritual manuals, Duldzin Rinpoche's ritual manuals. Duldzin Rinpoche is a disciple of the founder of the Geluk school. Okay, so again, a sectarian angle here, a very Geluk sectarian angle. All of these quotes, incidentally, come from the rituals that are specified to be performed in the 4th month of the calendar. So that each month has its own separate section. And in the 4th month, this is what you're doing. And it ends in this way. In this way, do principally the contour tones of both Vihasamaja, this tantric Buddha, and Vajrabhairava, another tantric Buddha, according to the glorious lower tantric college and those of the Vajra space, according to Shalu. Both those underlined places are central, are big major monasteries located in central Tibet. And the final line here, practice and do not let decline the previously established cycles of the contour tones of the Chakrasamvara Buddha and the Vairochana Buddha. The references to these Buddhas and their rituals, you don't just find them here being specified for a monastery in Inner Mongolia and Alasha, but you find the 5th Dalai Lama specifying them for monasteries in Eastern Tibet and Kham and elsewhere too. So again, what you're seeing is a very self-interested, you could say, sectarian interest in promoting its identity as it spreads across the Tibetan plateau and spreads into Mongolia. So this is a map borrowed from Karl Ravek's great atlas. The arrow is added here, but I'm here simply just giving a visual presentation of this movement over the course of about 100 and 200 years from central Tibet into northeastern Tibet and from there into Mongolia. This is a map from Isabel Charlot's book on Inner Mongolian monasteries. This is from a website that attempts to geolocate monasteries in Outer Mongolia. I think it's safe to say the majority of these, the vast majority of these are Geluk. This is a monastery in Xinjiang, which of course has been in the news tragically over the past couple of years for what's occurring there to Uyghurs and other Muslim minorities. But there are also Mongols there who've been there for a couple hundred years or more. I visited there 2 monasteries that are linked to monasteries back in northeastern Tibet because a Lama there in the 1990s penned constitutions for them. The monasteries date back far longer than that, but the constitutions are quite recent. And so I'm going to, I think, stop here. Yeah. And just summarize by saying we do have constitutions associated with other schools, other denominations, and some that are actually earlier than these that the Geluk made prolific. But they're different. They're different in their content. And what they're mostly concerned with, these other constitutions, are with, I think to summarize, to simplify, you could say they're private. They're very private in nature, meaning there's a Lama, it's his monastery or it's his retreat, and the practices that go on there are similarly private for the most part, like your own private meditation practice and regimen. Versus these constitutions that I've been talking with you today about, these Geluk constitutions, are much more public in nature. In fact, the word public comes up a lot. I mentioned it earlier in the context of the General Management Office, the public goods that were created for monks at these monasteries. And so there is a shift in the content of these monasteries so that there's an attempt to make visible by codifying their practices, to emphasize impartiality. It's not something I really spoke to today, except in the context of making sure that alms are properly distributed. They're public in a sense too of creating links between monasteries so that more peripheral monasteries are studying and practicing and doing what more centrally located monasteries are doing. And so in conclusion, I would say, when we talk about the success of religious institutions, in this case, I'm talking about the Geluk school of Tibetan Buddhism, but I would say this applies to all religious institutions. It's not enough to just think about what might pop into mind, like philosophy and debate or meditation, nor even to look at the very important variables of, say, patronage and the political, socio-political context of these monasteries. But we also want to look at what these religious figures themselves were doing to organize themselves. They were very bureaucratically oriented. And that had a lot to do with their success and their coherence as they spread across a very vast space and time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brenton. Floor is open. Actually, I have a question, if I may start, to bring us to the materiality of the constitutions, if we can sort through that. I guess my question, looking at the photographs that you showed us, the samples you showed us, there is one obviously very old document that's not particularly legible, but is being kept in the monastery. There is, that long yellow reproduction. There was the monastery that had the Chinese and the Tibetan both on the wall, and they're also the constitutions. I'm wondering if you can talk a bit more about the degree to which, if you will, the core of the Constitution is the text that is translatable, is copyable, versus the degree to which the material object of the Constitution itself, whether it is the original or a specific reproduction, whether that has special value. When a constitution is being sent by a lama from central Tibet to outer Mongolia, is it the content of the document, or is it the document itself that, the physical document itself that has the key importance?
So the object itself, the materiality of the text is important, yes. Another scholar has, Bertha Janssen, has pointed out how these very long yellow brocades is a format we also find with imperial edicts. So the format is very much imitating that. One monastery where I spent a lot of time, the monastery of Kunlung in northeastern Tibet, they are said to have kept a very large black paper gold ink version of the Constitution that I was never allowed to actually see. I came very close, but then was stymied at the last minute. It is, and there are also these texts, so the materiality does matter. Most of the versions I worked with are these block print versions that are kept in the collected works of the monasteries. So there is a sort of, there's a sort of discrepancy for the scholar working on this. Yeah, you're working with a version of the text that is not the version of the text that really, I think, most people at the monastery see. So I think the materiality matters, but also matters who is writing these things. They're often, almost always, written by recognized lamas from these more centrally located monasteries. And so there is a desire to get somebody with some repute to pen these for you. And sometimes their names are even mentioned, like in the preamble of the constitutions, you'll find what is in effect like a kind of colophon for the text, where you get a brief history of how it came to be. These lamas at this monastery realized there was a need for it, so they sought out this lama, and by mentioning him by name, they're also adding a bit of weight to the document itself.
So in the big yellow reproduction that you showed us at the end that there was a colophon there?
Yeah, a seal.
The seal. Okay, so that is a reproduction of the seal that is on the original.
Yeah.
And are there multiple copies of that big yellow one in big yellow form, or is that the only one?
It's the only one that I'm aware of.
So that in some ways materially is reproducing it, but representing the original document in a way that is different and more valued than the block version?
That's a good question. I don't really know. I know that the original, it seems to exist. I've seen images of it reproduced in a book, a 250-year anniversary of that monastery, that the head lama for that, Lamatan, the head lama for that monastery prepared. And there are photographic images of this, black and white images of the original document. It was written in a very stylized cursive script. This reproduction is not. But this reproduction was also closely guarded. So I didn't get to see the original. Presumably, I thought I was going to, and then it came out and I only later realized it was not the original when I compared the two scripts. Presumably because the original is far too valuable. It's 250, 270 years old or about, with a seal on it by a figure who was the chaplain to the Emperor of China. So I guess that's probably why I didn't see that one. But even the reproduction itself was quite valuable. It took some connections to get the disciplinarian to get out his keys to get it out for us to look at. So it's not a thing that you can easily see. And that's most of my experience with these constitutions, that typically they're pretty heavily guarded.
So there is one copy within the monastery that is heavily guarded. And sorry, would every monk in the monastery have, let's say, a block printout of it in his cell also, or do they don't have access to it except for those specific times of year when it's brought out? You said it's lectured on.
That's right. They wouldn't have access to it. I mean, in theory, they could now today go like I have done and find the collected works of the author and print it off, but that doesn't seem to happen. In fact, I've taken constitutions to monasteries and left them with them because I didn't know they had them before.
But you have access to them in the books on the library shelf.
In the books on the library shelf, and nowadays the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center, now known as the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, located in Cambridge, has done a lot of work in digitizing a lot of these collected works.
Okay, we have some questions on the floor, and I just will go in whatever order I first see your hands up. For the sake of the Zoomers, please do pose your question.
Oh, there is a hand up, I see.
As loud as you can, and if you are soft-spoken, one could just come closer to the mic of Brenton's computer.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much.
Louder.
This is a wonderful talk. Thanks so much. It's actually sort of a follow-up question because I was again interested in talking about the public nature of these documents. And I was really interested in that picture where the Constitution was printed on the wall of the courtyard.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just wondering if you had any sense that that would have ever happened in the 17th or 18th century, where would it either been printed on the wall or in some way put on display, even temporarily? And as a related question, and this is just because I don't know much about the period, do you have any sense of how the literacy rates were among monks? And so if those objects could be seen during that time, a way for them to get that content.
As far as whether these constitutions would have been hung up regularly, like this example of the very contemporary version of the Constitution being on display on these walls, I think no. There is one remark made about this by a scholar, but I don't think it's common at all for them to be, and it may be different for different schools, and it's just we don't know yet. One difference between our field and that of Cistercian studies and European history is there's still a whole lot we don't know. But I think the answer is no, they weren't really put on public display. And as far as literacy, I've seen, I think the anthropologist and modern historian Melvin Goldstein, I think he has suggested literacy rates somewhere around 5 to 10% maybe of monks. So, but by literacy, by which we mean the ability to read a document like this. In general, what they're reading are the prayers and memorizing loads of text, but without getting into the real meaning of it. So So yeah, I think to the extent that monks were actually exposed to this, it was at these periodic disciplinary sermons that the abbot or the disciplinarian gave.
But in the case that you showed of the Constitution on the wall and the two different textual versions, I mean, is that there year round, or was that pulled out for the occasion of a lecture?
Yeah, that's it's painted on the wall. It doesn't go anywhere, and it's also, it's not just unique in that way. It's also unique because it's bilingual. It is in a kind of borderland area between China proper and the Tibetan plateau, but that is still unique. And yeah, so monks would have the opportunity to study that in that case, but that's pretty unique.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. I'm a little bit one thing that strikes me here, and you can, the challenge me if this is wrong. In some ways, these chayik or these constitutional texts, they seem kind of redundant in the sense that they're doing kind of what the Vinaya is supposed to do. In other words, the Vinaya also has all these rules of conduct. You're supposed to do this, you're supposed to do that. And so the Vinaya being the sort of the Indian, much more ancient Indian code of conduct. So I'm wondering also, it kind of reminds the way this has been sort of textbookized. It reminds me of what sort of the Geluk sect also did, the philosophy, which you have all these sort of philosophies. And then the Geluk are sort of famous for reducing it to textbooks for debate. And I'm wondering if that analogy makes sense to you, sort of as a kind of, it's a textbook of discipline that would be found in there. And also specifically, is there much parallel between these constitutions and the sorts of rules that are given in this Vinaya?
Right, good questions. The analogy that you drew between what the Geluk school did with what are called textbooks or debate manuals, these ikcha, it's confusing because the Tibetan is ikcha for one and chayik for the other, but yeah, I think I do see a parallel there. They're codifying and specifying what is proper, what is orthodoxy, what is orthopraxy, and then they're disseminating it over space. The chayik, the constitutions are, I see them kind of as like bird's eye views of what goes on in a monastery, because you do get in these constitutions a view of like what the curriculum is supposed to be. You do get a view of what the liturgy is supposed to be. But if you really want to get into it, into the weeds, you do have to pull out these textbook manuals, the debate manuals, the ikcha. You have to pull out the chuju, the breviaries of the monastery. And then you'll start to get more details of who wrote. Some of these hymns are rather generically titled, and you don't know if it's the same hymn being performed at the monastery in central Tibet or not. So you really have to get into the weeds. These constitutions give us a bird's eye view of what's going on at the monastery, and we can see patterns and similarities. As far as the Vinaya is concerned, yes, there are some, I mean, there are direct quotations from the Vinaya or references to the Vinaya. The Vinaya, there's a very conscious recognition by the authors of these texts that they're doing something, or they're trying to do something similar to what they think the Vinaya does. But the details are actually very different. The positions within the monastery in 17th, 18th century Tibet are not the same that were in an Indian monastery. The who gets so many shares, that actually changes over time. And there are many cases where monasteries have multiple constitutions, and you can see a change where in the past it was left kind of open to the abbot, and now it's being specified. Or in the past, the head abbot got 40 shares, and now we only want 10. So I see a movement toward a more equitable distribution of alms. The hymns in the curriculum, of course, are very specific to Tibet, but you also even find in some of these constitutions very specific references, toponyms, references to locales. So I mentioned earlier the boundaries, the territory of the monastery be specified in one constitution, and another one, you see references to local communities, toponyms, specifying them as responsible for funding the monastery. And so in those ways, they're quite different from Vinaya. Yeah, there's one hand online too.
Yeah,
but when you-
so let's go Oliver, then the person zooming, and then the person in the darkness for third. So
Thank you very much for your talk. Hold on, loud enough. And my
louder,
question-
louder. Yeah.
I hope my question, I think the question is similar to the question before. I learned a lot of new things today, and I tend to compare everything new to something I don't already know. So Catholic monastic constitution had and have to be embedded into and complied with canon law. And on slide number 42, you mentioned that some monastic constitutions refer to the constitutions of other orders. And so my simple question is there also sort of Buddhist canon law? Customary or codified?
Right. Early on, someone suggested to me using the word customary to translate these terms, chayik, and I did probably recklessly because I don't really know that history so well. But yes, I don't know about canon law in the case of Tibet, but you do again have this. You first of all, you have layers of discipline. Professor Atwood mentioned the Vinaya, which is Indic in origin, but translated into Tibetan and read and to some degree and studied. In fact, it's in the curriculum of these monasteries for the most advanced students. And then you have after that or beyond that or on top of that, you could say these constitutions. And then you do have, yes, I think you're referring here to this point about mother monasteries, Magun and Bugun, these mother monasteries and child monasteries, or sometimes Gunlak, branch monasteries is the term that's used. So there is an understanding that those relationships mean, sometimes they mean financial relationships. There are certain occasions, ritual occasions where the child monasteries are expected to turn up at the mother monasteries. But you do also, there is an expectation of common liturgy and curricula at those monasteries, which facilitates travel also. And so for the ambitious monk, he would leave the periphery and go to more centrally located monasteries. If coming from Mongolia, they may just stop in Labrang and Amdo, or they may go farther and they may go all the way to central Tibet to the big monasteries there, like Jebung Monastery to study. And that process was facilitated by precisely these means, the fact that the curricula and the liturgy are being codified and disseminated in this way.
Thank you. So our Zoom question.
Yeah, so do I have to? Oh, so
yes, if you can unmute
Professor
yourself.
Duckworth, if you're still there, you can unmute yourself, I think, and ask your question.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. I really enjoyed your talk, and I still haven't read your book yet, so I'm looking forward to it. But I have a kind of a simple question, and if this analogy is appropriate, like I was thinking, this relationship between the mother monasteries and the kind of branch or child monasteries, is that something like a franchise? Like if we think about McDonald's, there's a certain template that the constitutions take. But yet there is some like regional variation. Like you mentioned that one constitution had, the boundaries, it laid out the boundaries. So it was local to an extent. But I'm just interested in that relationship between, I guess, the universal kind of top-down administrative template, if that is the case, and the kind of local franchise. Like if McDonald's goes to France, on the metric system, they don't call the quarter pounder the same thing, for instance. They have their own regional variations. I'm just curious about that.
Yeah, another scholar suggested to me that very analogy of franchise, and I think it's fitting. Some people, I think, in the religious context, don't like that comparison being drawn, but I think it's very fitting because, in the same way that people find comfort stepping into the same kind of space, whether they're in France or in the United States, again, that's what facilitates the kind of travel for young and ambitious monks from one place to another. And again, this wasn't an accident. There were constitutions being written, but there are also, this is something I don't really spell out as much in the book, and certainly didn't today, but lamas, the abbots of these monasteries were also, as we know, very on the move. And they were serving as abbots of usually for about 4 years on average, it seems to me, and then moving between other monasteries and serving as abbot there too. And so this is another way in which a kind of a homogeneous system of administration and practice would be input. So yeah, and then you have the example I mentioned of Xinjiang, those 2 Mongolic monasteries there, where, so you do have branch monasteries, and this is something we all know about in the fields of Tibetan studies and Mongolian studies and Buddhist studies, and yet it's still really poorly understood. It's not as simple. You can't just pull up a contract and say this franchise is owned by this person and owes certain dues to this corporate headquarters. It's not unfortunately that clear, but you do have occasionally references to certain financial obligations between institutions. More common, and what I think is just as interesting, are the liturgical connections. That's why I mentioned earlier the Mongolic monasteries in Xinjiang, where there are very clear liturgical connections between one monastery way up in Xinjiang and another way down in Qinghai province. Yeah, and it's not, it doesn't just stop at the text. The mother monasteries will send cantors, the specialists in the recitations of these prayers, to those monasteries, those more peripheral ones, to teach them how they're supposed to be recited, because you can't just read them off the page and know how they're supposed to be recited. And so we do know both historically and today that that's also something that happens to make sure that there is some continuity in the ritual program of the monasteries.
Just quick follow-up, and then you, what is the administrative means by which an abbot moves from one monastery to another? And who is doing, is it entrepreneurial? Is it an assignment from a mother house? What is the line of command there?
Well, it's specified in the constitutions that in the cases that I've seen, you'll have specified officers within the monastery, the disciplinarians, former abbots, the general management council. Those will be involved in inviting a lama to come and then to take up the post. And in at least one constitution I've seen, it specified that their post should be about 4 years. So it's meant to be a rotating thing. It's meant to be, the abbot is, his role is very important, but his powers are restricted in that way. They're kind of term limits, you could say. And there's other sorts of expectations that the abbot are held to, just like any other monk or officer.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, finally, yeah, question.
Is the digitization of these scripts and of these constitutions centralized, or have they diversified control of power? Liturgical, like the rituals.
So the digitization.
Yeah.
The digitization is done by scholars. It's done, well, there are various digital repositories over around the world, but I would say by far the largest and most commonly used is the one I mentioned earlier, the Tibetan Buddhist Resource Center, or the Buddhist Digital BDRC, the Buddhist Digital Resource Center, located in Cambridge, formerly in New York, done by scholars there. And it is just an effort to digitize and make publicly available as many Buddhist documents, many Buddhist documents as possible. Started off with exclusively Tibetan Buddhist ones, Tibetan language ones, and now it's moved over into other languages as well. But except for copyright issues, it is open to anyone to look at. Sorry, one more thing really quickly. There are certain texts that you can't view because of certain sectarian bans on it being unavailable to the uninitiated. Maybe that's kind of more in what you were thinking about too.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, if I'm some kind of Buddhist monastery or trained in one school, then we more easily, diverge when we have access to the internet or access to other digitized constitutions. So I was just wondering whether that was centralized or diversified.
I don't know that the digital thing has changed things all that much, but or maybe it will. But interestingly, you do see in these constitutions, and occasionally you see this reference to uncommon, the uncommon section of the Constitution, where you find then the liturgy of the monastery. And I didn't understand why it was uncommon. Usually that term uncommon is used specifically in the context of Tantra, certain tantric practices that are meant only for the initiated. But here it was being included in at least two cases that I can think of for the liturgy of the monastery. And when I was asking for access to the Constitution, I was at first told no. In fact, I was continually told no. I found it by other means. And they said because it was the uncommon part of the monastery, by which I guess means it's what makes it unique. Yeah.
Okay, Eileen and Zach.
I just want to make sure that we get to the chat questions, so I'll just read them out. We have one, are the constitutions ever amended? And a second, have you encountered constitutions in which administrative procedures like the election of an abbot are described?
Yeah, so definitely there are, as I mentioned a moment ago, cases where the administrative positions, what qualities the individual is supposed to have, and also how they're to be appointed, those are described. And I do think this is one of the things that sets the Geluk apart from other schools, at least at this early 17th, 18th century period, because other schools, they were, as I said, more private in nature. It was the Lama, his monastery, his hermitage, his encampment, and so forth. Are constitutions ever amended? They are, there are multiple, I don't know if they're amended, but they're rewritten. They're new constitutions written for a same monastery. So in the case of Geluk, for instance, it seems to be at least 4 that may have been written, but today I only have seen 2 of those. They're not all extant. But yes, there are definitely cases where constitutions are rewritten, and the reasons that are given are usually very kind of formulaic, saying, well, times have changed, there's need for new rules. So you have to read between the lines to try to understand what it is that's going on. And in one really interesting case in Amdo, it's clearly a power dynamics between 2 very big monasteries, one known as Geluk, the other Serkok, and a branch monastery. The one is actually probably the second or third image I showed. There's a long brocade laid out on the floor and it had lots of holes in it. That dates from, I think, 1757. And that small branch monastery had at one point been a branch of Geluk. But at one point, Serkok, this other monastery, had risen in power and it became its branch. This constitution seems to date to shortly after that transition. And it's penned by the abbot of that Serkok monastery. So it does seem to be playing a role in that kind of conversion. You also do see sectarian conversion, denominational conversion. These constitutions play a role as well.
Thank you. That was really interesting. I studied 16th, 17th century, but in England. But there was some really, for me, very interesting resonance. The things that you talk about that maybe are propagated by the system, the regularization and dissemination of the same liturgy, the same rituals, the kind of specification, concretization of individualized local practices into this more general. This sounds, very much like a very, very traditional narrative about print culture in Europe. That what print brings is kind of fixity, regularity, specification, dissemination, uniformity, right? Now, these are sometimes handwritten, they're sometimes block printing, so that, in a sense, I'm not trying to equate them, but it seemed like part of what you were arguing is that, among, I take it, several different Buddhist orders or denominations in the area, that like this one did have a kind of like competitive advantage, and that part of what allowed it to become so dominant in the 7th century was something about this particular use of text, the technology of text. And I just wonder if you could put a finer point on that. Like, what are the other group? There are multiple groups, right, at this time. Like, are they not? Is the innovation in the Constitution itself? Is it, do you think, the particular way that they are disseminating them, like in scrolls or in block printing, or is it the networking? Like, what is it about the dissemination of these constitutions for the Geluk denomination that helps to make it so successful? I'm sure there are other, maybe spiritually it was more appealing for sociological reasons or whatever, but in focusing on the constitutions, like what did they give? What did they have? What did they innovate there, and why? Why didn't other groups develop this kind of interlocking network of regularized constitutions that would enable that spread?
Yeah. In listening to your question about like what the Geluk did that really made them unique compared with other schools, say the Karma Kagyu school, which was a very powerful school in 16th and early 17th century Tibet, central Tibet. At first, I thought to say something about printing, because the Geluk do seem to, other scholars have shown that the Geluk seem to have had a real handle on that, of the printing culture. One of the earliest texts to be mass produced in Tibet in the 14th century were the collected works of Tsongkhapa, the founder of the Geluk school. But I don't want to say more about that, because I don't know that printing was actually the way in which these were disseminated. I confess that this is one of the areas I think we don't know all that much about how they were, but it was likely instead these handwritten scrolls, the way in which they were disseminated. The other thing that's peculiar is that the Geluk aren't really known for composition. The scholar George Dreyfus has talked, he's written a great article about the different pedagogies of the Geluk versus the other schools of Tibetan Buddhism. And whereas the Geluk school is kind of known more for its debate style and oral learning, the other schools were more focused on commentary and written composition. So the Geluk aren't known for writing a lot, but I do think it's what they write is different when you do look at what they write. And so I mentioned very briefly at the end how there are earlier constitutions. So the Geluk did not innovate the constitution. They, in fact, the earliest in Tibet that we know of dates back to the 11th century. But there are very, very few until you get to the 17th century and until you get to the 5th Dalai Lama, the Geluk coming into power then. And also the content is, again, very different. So when you do, I think one of the biggest exceptions when I was near the closing stages of this book and Jerry was giving me pressure to finish, or others were giving me pressure to finish, I came across a 100+ page compilation of constitutions written by another school that was very early, the Karma Kagyu school. And it was written in a very, it was handwritten manuscript written in this stylized cursive script, which was infuriating, but I worked through it and as best I could. And the content is, again, very different. It was a compilation of a lot of smaller constitutions written for a bunch of different hermitages or smaller sites connected with the hierarch of that school, the Karma Kagyu. So there are, they're referred to as my monasteries. The T's that are disseminated are by my hand, quote. There are some similarities. There is a sectarian angle in some of these constitutions. There are some very brief references to a curricula being studied, so a scholasticism there too. But again, for the most part, it is a more private enterprise. Meditation is often emphasized, and meditation on one's own is emphasized. That's not the case in these Geluk. These are assembly where dozens and hundreds and thousands of monks are getting together at the same time and performing these rituals. And so I think it's more about how they changed, with the innovation that is how they use these constitutions to their advantage to codify, as you said, to codify and disseminate these practices.
That's fascinating too. Sorry, but if literacy rates were really that old, it does seem like the oral nature of this sect of Buddhism might have been what allowed it to grow.
The oral nature of it, you're saying?
Yeah, that, while they had constitutions that were making things more uniform, even that information was often given in oral form as like a lecture, and that maybe was sort of like the lack of written text as foundational to be spread out.
Yeah.
Yeah, I also feel like it's interesting to push on this politics of the Geluk school here, if that's even the right way to frame it. I mean, in some sort of, is it wrong to think of this as a competitive sectarian moment or era, and that these constitutions are part of, winning over adherence, whether through oral recitation, the use of writing or printing, that the technology is part of that. I mean, are there monasteries that are flipping allegiance to? I mean, I know this is sort of a.
Yeah, it is very much. I don't think there's any reason.
Artifacts and these practices are kind of playing a role in a competition.
Yeah, political is very much the right word. There in Tibet, it's very complicated because you have this notion of the political and the worldly and the dharma, the worldly and the other worldly being united, and it takes different guises. But the political, the worldly is always there, and so in the time of the fifth Dalai Lama and the lead up to him, things were not, the religious arguments were not settled. The sectarian arguments were not settled in central Tibet. And as other historians have shown, it was through the conquest of Oirat peoples from Western Inner Asia that assisted in the Geluk squashing their enemies, which were both political and religious. So in that context, in that sense, it was very political there. But even later, when the Manchu Qing Empire, based in Beijing, decided that the Geluk was the school they too wanted to patronize, then it became attractive to, I would say, inner Mongols, princes who sought out lamas in Amdo to pen for their monasteries back home constitutions. So yeah, I think they're both religious and political.
You mentioned the Qing, just reminded me, I mean, there are Geluk monasteries in Beijing, for example. Did any of them have chayiks of this nature? And are they different?
I don't know. I'm sorry to say. I don't know whether there are Geluk monasteries in Beijing and in Manchuria, and I don't know whether any of them had constitutions. Something I'll need to look into. Yeah.
One of the strangest things for me that you brought up in your constitutions is the construction of a class society, an economic class society within the monastery. That is that pay scale where the abbot gets a lot of wealth and food, and the person underneath gets a bit less, and it goes all the way down to a level of share that is, I don't know, if that's like subsistence level, then the abbot is way up top, earning a lot of money in cake and whatever. And I guess it's more an observation than a question, but I mean, it's very puzzling to me. And I mean, is the monastery through these constitutions also setting up something that's a bureaucracy through which like people can make their fortunes within the monastery. There's, do you have going to the Renaissance English context of new men who are rising up and becoming wealthy and powerful. And I mean, I understand that in relation to the kind of secular quasi-governmental understanding of the monastery, and it's like hard for me from the Western context of reconciling that fully within a religious context, right? That I mean, of course, in the West, you know, abbots probably, you know, could sneak in more food than other monks, but to have it so hierarchical and so based on, if you will, if not economic power, economic reward, is very strange. And I realize that's not a question, but I mean, can you expound on that a bit more, on that thing that seems such a peculiarity to us, I think, who, is it only me or to anybody?
Haven't you heard of the Reformation?
The kind of Western.
You know, like the Reformation, it's kind of like attacking abbots for getting very rich.
Well,
Yeah, but I mean, it's so tiered. I mean, there are how many categories are there of different?
Oh, there's lots of pay scales if you look at those things. I think there were, you know, who got what, how much why, you know.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's other things.
I think there's a lot we still don't know about Tibet and what changes when, but I see what the Geluk do in that long quote I gave you of specifying the pay scale from 10 shares at the top to 1 share at the bottom and everything in between as a way of actually reining in the powers of the abbot. So the abbots, I don't think actually got rich off of being an abbot in Tibet. There were huge financial obligations upon that the abbot had to fulfill. And you really had to already have some wealth, I think, to do the job. Then the estate of the abbot would have certain assets available to it to pay, but it was very expensive to be an abbot. And I think in the constitutions, what I see instead are attempts to try to circumscribe the powers of the abbot. So someone asked, like, are they ever revised? Well, there's one case where an early constitution, there's one case where a constitution says previously the abbot is said to have received 40 shares. Henceforth, he only shall receive 10 shares. You also see references to the general fund, the jisa, the general fund of the monastery that's under the auspices of this general management council, and very explicit references to it being off limits to the abbot. And so this is money for the monks at the monastery. The abbot has his own funds. The abbot has to pay for certain ritual occasions, but there is an attempt, I think, in these constitutions to actually, prevent the encroachment of power by the abbot. What I think happens instead in Tibet is you see the growth and power of what are called lamas, these reincarnating figures like the Dalai Lama. They have their own estates, which compound over a lifetime and multiple lifetimes. Those become quite wealthy. And then those are kind of beyond the powers and abilities of the monastery to contend with. And so at least in the case of Amdo or northeastern Tibet, which is the area I'm most familiar with, those lamas really came to overshadow the process of selecting abbots and everything else there. So whatever constraints were put in place to try to protect the fair and equitable distribution of alms and the running of the monastery, they couldn't really handle the growth and power and wealth of these lamas.
Okay, well, I guess that brings our session to conclusion. And again, I want to thank you so much for wonderful presentation that I know I, for one, just learned a huge amount, which is one of the great pleasures of this workshop. So thank you.
Thank you.